Hey there everyone, it's Russell. Welcome to the Reading Fabricator. I hope you're doing well. I've been reading lots of books and I've decided to go back to my reading list from the start of the year where I did my 24 books I want to read in 2024. I did sort of like a checklist a while ago now and realized that I'd only read like 3 books out of the 24. I sort of strayed away from the path pretty quickly, so I'm going to go back to that list now, try and get as many of those ticked off as I possibly can. I mean, those were the ones that I really wanted to focus on this year. And I decided to give this one a go because at the time I thought it would be a nice, quick, easy read. It was anything but, and that's not a bad thing. It is Faith, Hope, and Carnage by Seán Hagan and Nick Cave, a series of conversations distilled into a 300-page book. I think it took place over the course of like a few years back, and it's about they had 40 or so hours of conversational material, and they condensed it into this basically like an 8-hour read book. I thought I could get through this in 2 days. Took me a month. Okay, and that's not because it's a bad book. It's because of the thematics that are going on in it. The depth of the conversation in it is incredibly piercing. It takes a lot out of you, and what it did was it made me only read sectionals at a time, and then put the book down for a couple of days just to process it. I did a lot of processing with this book, and it made me wonder what it would be like to read the entire 40-hour series of interviews, which would probably be turned into something like a 1,200-page book, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing because there's so much more material to read, but a bad thing because if it took me a month to read a 300-page conversation, how long would it take me? How long would it take me to read a 1,200-page book? Probably near 6 months. And I've always been a fan of Nick Cave. I mean, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds are in my top 3 bands of the 21st century. It's Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Radiohead, and The National. And he's always been a very interesting, mythical, elusive figure. I mean, Nick Cave is someone who typically shuns interviews, or when he gives interviews, he's very withholding. He doesn't really express a lot about himself. That's an entirely different thing going on in this book here. In this book here, he lays it all out for you. His writing process, everything to do with his life, everything to do with his bandmates, his faith in particular. There's a lot of talks about faith in this book. And in particular, the one theme that keeps coming around in a loop is the idea of traumatic grief. I mean, for those who are fans of him would know that he also lost a son recently, but before this book was published, he lost his previous son back in, I think, 2014, 2015, when he was off his head on drugs and he accidentally went off a cliff and died that way. And that really surprised me, was just how much he talked about his son in this book, in this conversation. I didn't think he would talk about it. I thought he'd be withholding like he normally is in interviews, but he's not. He really goes into it in a lot of detail, and he talks about the healing process, how he got past that, and how through his son's death, he sort of went down a different path as a musician. He became less angry, which is evident in the way that the music of the Bad Seeds has sort of shifted from the really aggressive punk days of the Birthday Party and even the early 90s. And then you got the sort of the alt rock of the late 90s to the late 2000s with Dick Lazarus Dick. And then you had their last 3 albums, and then their collaborative effort with Warren Ellis, Carnage. So you have Push the Sky Away, Skeleton Tree, Ghosteen, and then Carnage. And these 4 albums are very, very thematically different and musically different from their previous works. I'm actually a big fan of Push the Sky Away. I mean, Jubilee Street, Mermaids, Higgs Boson Blues, among my favorite songs of the 21st century. Beautiful songs. But what struck me most about this conversation, and these aren't 2 people who don't know each other. Him and Seán have known each other for decades. They've become quite good friends, and you can see the progression of their friendship also through these conversations, which I think took place around the COVID time. Is just how beautifully illustrative Nick Cave is with his words. He does withhold a couple of times. There's a few times where Seán will ask him a question, and he sort of you could see him being a bit elusive about answering that question. But I think that's to the credit of Seán, who is, by all accounts, according to this book here, is just a great interviewer. He knows how to get through Nick Cave's barriers and defenses to get the proper answer out of him. And what the answers you do get from Nick Cave, and sometimes he'll go on for quite a long time, are unlike anything I've heard before or seen of Nick Cave talk before in interviews. If you want to know more about the man, read this book. This will give you everything you need to know about him. This is him. It talks about everything. It covers a wide range of topics. And there were so many passages in this book that are highlighted because they're beautifully described. And in all honesty, the book it reminded me the most of was Cormac McCarthy's last book, Stella Maris. It itself a fictional conversation between two people, but the writing, the way she spoke in Stella Maris, it reminded me of the way Nick Cave speaks in this book here. Even though Nick Cave speaks of faith and music a lot, and the idea of incorporating that faith into his songwriting process, and obviously Alicia Weston in Stella Maris talks about philosophy and mathematics. The one connecting theme between the two, between Nick Cave and the fictional Alicia Weston in Stella Maris, is the idea of grief. That's the connecting thread there. I saw that multiple times, and there were plenty of times where I'd read a chapter or a distilled interview in this book, and I would put it down and go and read a section from Stella Maris, and then spend a few days processing it. So there was a connective thread there. Obviously, Stella Maris is a fictional conversation, and this one's a real conversation. But I can see some sort of illusory connection there, and it really shook me actually. It makes me want to go back and read Stella Maris in its entirety. But of course, to read Stella Maris in its entirety, I would have to also reread The Passenger, which I do plan on doing that as well. But one thing to also take into account that this is a conversation. It's not a memoir. It's not an autobiography. If anything, this is much better than autobiography because it's in Nick Cave's own words, and it's sort of on the spot answering rather than, writing his words down and then over the course of the months, changing a little bit. Because if Nick Cave was to write his own autobiography, obviously he would obsess over it and probably make it a bit more harder to get through to him than just these conversations which he gives on the spot answers, so you get to see the real him. But the problem I had was I just kept on highlighting everything. I mean, I got the beautiful hardcover here. But because of the industry I work in, which is fabricational engineering, I had to buy it on the Kindle so that I wouldn't get the book dirty every time I was reading it at work. And there were so many passages that I highlighted which talk about every different type of topic. So this first passage here talks about his songwriting process and how it shifted. So here's Seán's question. That makes me think of the idea of the disrupted narrative I have heard you talk about in relation to your songwriting, how both the subject matter and meaning of your more recent songs have become less straightforward and more elusive. Nick answers, well, exactly. My songs have definitely become more abstracted, for want of a better word, and yes, less dominated by traditional narrative. At some point, I just grew tired of writing third-person songs that told a structured story that began at the beginning and moved obediently towards their conclusion. I just became suspicious of the form. It felt unfair to inflict those stories on people all the time. It felt like a kind of tyranny. It was almost as if I was hiding behind these neat, manicured narratives because I was afraid of the stuff that was boiling away inside me. I wanted to start writing songs that were truer somehow, that were authentic to my experience. That was a great moment for me because I was really curious as to why he shifted to this new era, this more abstract, sonically diversive, less traditional type of songwriting. And there are a lot of Nick Cave fans out there, particularly when they are asking questions on the Red Hand Files, which is a site where that fans publish questions and he'll respond to them directly, although he'll only pick one at a time every week. And obviously a lot of fans prefer his earlier stuff to some now, but there's quite a lot of people who have gravitated towards his new stuff. I'm actually quite a big fan of Carnage as well. I think Carnage there, Nick Cave and Warren Ellis's collaborative effort, which has nothing to do with the Bad Seeds, I think that's a pretty great record. This next one's where he's talking about Arthur's death and the idea of grief. So Seán says, yes, and nothing prepares you for it. It's tidal and it can be capsizing. Nick replies, that's a good word for it, capsizing. But I also think it is important to say that these feelings I'm describing, this point of absolute annihilation, is not exceptional. In fact, it is ordinary in that it happens to all of us at some point or another. We are all, at some point in our lives, obliterated by loss. If you haven't been by now, you will be in time, that's for sure. And of course, if you have been fortunate enough to have been truly loved in this world, you will also cause extraordinary pain to others when you leave it. That's the covenant of life and death and the terrible beauty of grief. That's just a beautiful way to answer the question. His mind must be running at 1,000 miles per hour in order to conjure these sentences to respond to a question in such an elegant way. I wouldn't be able to do that. I'd have to spend like 2 minutes sitting there just to be able to put together the thoughts in order to answer a question as beautifully as I possibly could. So I think there's these little situations in this book here where I realized that Nick Cave is a musical genius that is almost unparalleled. There's a few other musicians out there that I think are musical geniuses, such as Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead, even Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails when he's moved on to the whole movie scoring business with Atticus Ross, and just something very different about these type of people compared to the traditional pop stars that you see around there. That even though they're great too, I just find something more challenging with people like Nick Cave that that adheres to me. I like to be challenged a lot, in terms of movies and music and reading books. I like to push the boundaries a bit more. So reading things like that really got through to me. The thing that happened that changed everything was that Arthur died. Talking about this stuff, the past, all these stories, feels like I am speaking about another person, a different life. It feels like I am recounting stories from across a deep divide. The stories hold no real value to me and all seem slightly beside the point. I can talk about these things, the drugs and all that, but the past has no purchase, no intrinsic meaning. It represents a whole life that has been severed and cut adrift from the life I lead now. That is why I tried to stop Mark Mordu's biography. I had a strange unsettling feeling that the past no longer applied. The past had become irrelevant. So Mark Mordu published this biography of Nick Cave, which detailed his early years a few years back. I haven't read it, but I don't really plan to. I'd rather read books that are in Nick Cave's words or like in a conversational form like this. I do want to get around to reading, the Death of Buddy Monroe and the Ass or the Angel, because if his songwriting is anything to go by, and if his answers in this question are anything to go by, he's obviously a very good writer. But as I said before, I mean, this book covers everything. He covers his drug-addled days, the formation of the birthday party, the musical riffs, and that are conjured in his songs and his transition from the different periods, and even the sort of the issues he had with certain bandmates that I didn't even know existed, such as with Blixer and with Mick Harvey, with those two sort of leaving the band there. I thought they just left on their own terms. I didn't realize that there was a whole issue behind it all. And I think a big issue of that was the fact that, Blixer didn't like the guitar changing period. He was quite prolific in the 90s and that, and then he just didn't like the way the music was transitioning for the Bad Seeds. And obviously you got Mick Harvey, who, from the sounds of it, he didn't quite go into detail, but it seems like Mick Harvey had a bit of a problem with how much Warren Ellis was involved in the music writing part of it all. But that's just what happens, because bands or great bands like to transition from sound to sound. They don't want to reproduce the same thing over and over again. They want to experiment. So we've got Seán that says, "Can I ask, does it also have to do with encroaching mortality?" Nick Cave tries to push the question away. So about half a page down the thing, he responds, "I like how you neatly sidestep the question." And Nick replies, "About encroaching mortality? Yes. I don't really look at death in that way, I guess. The idea of encroaching mortality isn't a concern. The idea of death as a sort of end game, something separate waiting down the line, it feels like that to me. I guess I feel day to day and in a profound way enmeshed to death, as if it is a clear and present state of being that manifests itself in sort of vitality. I feel a certain receptivity to a positive influence or presence. Susie feels the same, not that she speaks about it, but you can see it in everything she does. This invigorating force, born of a hard-earned understanding of the immediate and urgent proximity of death. I'm not trying to be morbid here, Seán, but death feels all around." A lot of what Nick talks about, especially in the second half of the book, is how through healing in regards to the grief that he felt after Arthur's death, he sort of began to incorporate a lot more faith into his life, including going to church and that sort of thing. And I thought what was really interesting was that when they found out that Arthur died, he was on the back step for a few days afterwards, just smoking countless cigarettes, just processing it all. And then not long afterwards, he just went straight to Warren Ellis's house and got back to work. His idea of the healing process was to just keep on working. I find that fascinating. I wonder if any other people out there sort of have that feeling where, in order to cope with grief, they just have to get to work and work as hard as they can, to work as hard as they can. And it's those sections of the book that really hit hardest for me, where I had to put it down even after reading a few pages for a few days, and just really process what was going through this man's mind. And that's what I found really strange. I mean, honestly, I thought I could read this in 2 days. I was dead wrong. I had to keep on putting it down to think about it. The conversations that are in this book are some of the greatest conversations I've ever read, and they hit me pretty hard. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are sections that are quite funny, and there's also a wonderful section where he talks about he's getting back into he's starting a new hobby, sort of clay figurine making, which apparently he was doing when he was a kid. And there's a wonderful section there where he talks about this series that he's making of the devil from life till death. It's absolutely interesting. I really want to look up pictures of it just to see what they look like. I'll read this passage out to you. I think it's absolutely amazing. So Seán says, "So can you talk me through the overarching narrative, the protagonist's journey?" Nick replies, "Well, it essentially traces the life of a man with horns, the devil, in 18 ceramic figures that grow in gravitas as the series proceeds. It begins with the devil's birth, which is a beautiful little sculpture of a baby awakening nestled against a red fowl. Next, the child inherits the world. Then, I need to get this in the right order. He grows up, is initiated into the world by a sailor, seduces a woman, fights a lion, goes off to war on a horse, comes back empowered by the war and decked out in medals, takes a bride, kills his first child, becomes separated from the world by his evil deeds, and grows old, falls into a state of abject misery and remorse, dances his final dance, and dies a bloody death in the arms of 2 sailors. Eventually his body is found by a spirit child, who kneels and extends his hand in forgiveness." Doesn't that just sound brilliant? And this is all told in ceramic figurines in a series. I really want to look up pictures of it, if he has posted pictures of it, just to see it. What a wonderful artistic mind this man has. And what a wonderful band Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and what a wonderful collaborative partnership Nick Cave and Warren Ellis is. There's so much to dive into there. I was really moved by this book. It's a wonderful book. Again, it's not a memoir. It is a conversational piece between 2 old friends. And I wish there was more of it, but I also wish there wasn't more of it, because it meant that there'll be more to process. A wonderful book. It is the ultimate guide to understanding Nick Cave. And I highly recommend it. It's excellent. Now, getting back to my 24 books that I want to read in 2024, it's going to be very hard to get all done now, but I'm getting back in that direction. I want to tick off more of them. So I've started reading the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, and I've also downloaded The Crossing by Cormac McCarthy. I have the paperback of The Crossing here, but I've only ever made it a third of the way through the book, the section with the boy and the she-wolf. But I really want to finish it. I mean, I did say back at the start of the year during that Cormac McCarthy reading project that I was going to read the rest of his books, and I've read some. I just have 2 more books to go, The Crossing and Cities of the Plain. If I can get those 2 books done this year, I'll be very happy. Thank you so much for watching this. Hope you enjoyed it. If you're a fan of Nick Cave, let me know what you think, and if there's anything else about Nick Cave in terms of books, literature, or even if there's any other interviews out there, please post below. I'll be very curious to see. Thank you so much for watching this, and have a good day. See ya.